Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a corner of Viking life that most documentaries like to politely skip over. The places where Viking justice shut you away. Picture this: a freezing night, the tang of smoke and seawater in the air, your hands raw from hauling nets or swinging an axe, and suddenly you're dragged before a chieftain accused of theft or feud. You might think they'd lock you in a nice wooden jail with fresh straw, right? Think again. Tonight you're about to stand in the doorway of a world where justice was swift, brutal, and icy cold. Literally. You probably won't survive this one, folks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a battered village after dusk, boots biting into half-frozen mud. The sound of gulls echoes off the gray water, and smoke drifts up from scattered longhouses. The harsh clang of an iron hammer still carries from the smithy, but most of the settlement has gone quiet, people tucked behind plank doors. Here in Viking society, they did not build massive prisons with cells and corridors. Their idea of punishment was so different you'd barely recognize it. The local thingman, the Council of Free Farmers, would hold court on an open field or a rough wooden platform, doling out judgments where the sky could watch. And if they decided you had to be locked away, well, you were in for the most miserable holding cells you can imagine. These weren't long-term jails with clean straw and 3 meals a day. Instead, you'd find yourself lowered into a pit barely wider than your shoulders, or stuffed into a drafty shed with a dirt floor that sucked every drop of warmth out of your bones. If the earth was too frozen to dig, they'd jam you inside a hut made for goats, trapping you with heavy stones across the door. The air stank of mildew, rotting fish, and fear. One wrong word to the wrong chieftain, and this was where you might end up. Historians still argue whether the Vikings really saw these cells as punishment or more as a waiting room for execution or outlawry. Some think they were just practical. After all, you couldn't risk someone running off before the next assembly could confirm their sentence. But from the way you can still smell terror in these places, it feels like punishment to me. You run a hand along rough timber as you peek into one such holding cell. The walls are cold, leaky, and lined with iron rings. If you were really unlucky, you'd be chained to one of those rings by the ankle or wrist, barely able to move. The floor is a slurry of mud and straw. Vermin scuttle through the corners. Some prisoners even left scratch marks. Desperate lines counting the days, or prayers scrawled with a broken bone, as if the gods might notice and set them free. One odd tidbit pops into your head while you picture this. There's a half-mythic saga describing how a Viking lawman let prisoners share dried fish heads, believing the fish eyes would see their souls and shame them into telling the truth. It sounds ridiculous now, but hey, a little supernatural guilt trip never hurt. Even if you survived the cold and filth, you wouldn't be guaranteed a fair hearing. Viking law was heavy on compensation, vengeance, and power plays, light on forgiveness. A rich family might bribe their way out of these cells, while a poor farmer's son could rot alone until a relative scraped together enough silver to ransom him. And if nobody came, the ground outside the village was always ready to welcome a body no one claimed. You breathe in the night, shivering a bit, even though you're only imagining it. These places were built more to break your spirit than to correct your crime. You could hear every bird's call, smell every hearth fire from free folk walking by, while you sat there powerless. There's a special cruelty in letting you see freedom through a crack in the planks, a joke on the prisoner, really, And yes, that might sound like a detail from a medieval horror film, but it was very real. As you lean back against the wall, you picture someone locked away in these cells, hungry, cold, maybe praying to Thor or Freya, maybe cursing the day they were born. Every creak of timber above them would sound like a death sentence. Would their family come? Would the council change its mind? These questions gnawed worse than any rat in the straw. And all the while, the villagers went about their daily business, feeding animals, weaving cloth, haggling at the market, barely glancing at the prisoner in the earth-worn hole nearby. Viking life was harsh, and so was Viking justice. No one was going to waste time worrying over one unlucky outlaw. So, you steady your breath, step out of that cold pit in your mind, and walk across the muddy square. There are more truths waiting. Truths about punishments that had nothing to do with locking you up and everything to do with breaking you down in even crueler ways. You leave that moldy, claustrophobic cell behind and follow the path toward the heart of the settlement, where Viking justice took its most famous, or you might say infamous, form. The Thing Assembly. No big stone courthouse with solemn judges here. Instead, a ring of standing stones on a grassy patch, with farmers, warriors, chieftains, and their kin all gathering to decide your fate in the open air. You can practically hear the rough accents arguing, the weight of axes on shoulders, the way people smelled of sweat, salt, and damp wool cloaks. Justice in the Viking world was a public performance, and you were the main act. Imagine standing there, accused of stealing a goat, or worse, a neighbor's silver. You'd be ringed by villagers who all knew your name, every mistake you'd ever made, and every feud your cousins had started 3 generations back. Nothing was private. The assembly didn't just weigh your crime, it weighed your family's honor, your social ties, even your grandfather's reputation, and you, oh, unlucky you, could be forced to speak up for yourself without a lawyer, without a script, without any guarantee the crowd wouldn't just laugh you off the field. Historians still argue whether these assemblies truly gave everyone a fair voice, or if they mostly favored the powerful. You'd better believe the local chieftain's cousin had a much easier time defending himself than some landless fisherman. Even if you had a decent case, a well-placed bribe or a gift of good mead could tilt the verdict. Fair? Maybe if you squinted. And there was the concept of compensation, the Viking obsession with paying for wrongs in silver or livestock instead of jail time. Steal someone's cow? Pay him a cow back, plus maybe another one for his trouble. Kill a man? Pay the weregild, the man price, to his family. And if you couldn't pay, or if the victim's kin refused to take the price, then things could turn lethal real quick. A feud could break out, lasting generations, painting entire family lines in blood. One fringe but fascinating tidbit. In some regions, if you insulted someone's honor and couldn't pay, they might demand a duel, a holmgang, on a small island or in a roped-off field. That's trial by combat, Viking style. 2 people with axes, swords, or even staves, fighting until first blood or, occasionally, until one of them fell down for good. You'd best hope you were a good talker or a good fighter. There was no other way out. So picture yourself standing there, the raw wind making your teeth ache, explaining why you snuck into a barn for a handful of grain. The farmer whose grain you took, his cousins are glaring, hands on knife hilts. The chieftain's voice booms out across the crowd. Even kids get to watch, tugging at their mother's sleeves with wide eyes. And you can see the spot where, if you lose your case, you might have to fight it out tomorrow with a sword in front of the same crowd. As you listen to these harsh old laws being recited, you realize they're not only about rules, they're about survival. These settlements didn't have the resources for big jails or endless guards. You wronged someone, you paid, or you paid with your blood. Simple, right? Brutal, but simple. The idea of honor weaves through all of this like a thread of iron. A family without honor had nothing. You might remember how, in some later medieval societies, a thief could be shamed with a branding iron. Here, the shame was sharper. You'd stand before neighbors who'd known you since you were small, your mother's tears soaking her sleeve, while the entire community measured you like a pig at the market. That public exposure alone could make a grown warrior shake. And if the assembly ruled against you, well, there were no appeals courts. That was it. In theory, you could leave, flee the area, but then you became an outlaw, literally outside the law. Anyone could kill you on sight, and no one would have to pay for it. You'd be fair game, like a fox with its paw in a trap. You look around the ring of stones, feel the rough winter grass under your boots, and wonder how many desperate prayers have been whispered here. Maybe a boy hoping the elders will go easy on him. Maybe a woman pleading that her brother's weregild can be paid. Maybe a chieftain himself, trying to keep a hot-headed feud from burning down half the valley. And that's the heartbreak of Viking justice. It had a logic that made sense if you squinted. Keep the peace. Keep trade going, keep families from butchering each other without rules. But it was still vicious. A single careless act could ruin not just you, but your kin for years. And nobody would pity you too long. Life was too hard for pity. So, you step away from that thing site, the voices fading into the chill. There are more punishments to look at, more creative, cruel, or downright bizarre ways the Vikings kept order. And you, unlucky traveler, will see them all before the night is done. You leave the open-air thing behind, boots crunching on the frost-glazed earth, and head for the dark shape of the chieftain's hall. That's where some of the most humiliating Viking punishments took place, ones that didn't even require a sword or a pit to scare you into submission. You might think these tough sea raiders would only respect brutal force, but let me tell you, they could wield public shame like a razor. Inside the hall, torchlight dances over beams crusted with soot, catching on iron cauldrons and embroidered tapestries. You can almost smell the stale ale, sweat, and damp fur cloaks hanging from pegs. Here is where the Nid rituals happened. Social punishments aimed straight at your reputation. Imagine being forced to stand before the whole settlement while a skald sang verses mocking your failures. Maybe you'd cheated in trade or broken a marriage vow. The mocking would be loud, humiliating, unstoppable, burning into your memory like a brand. Historians still argue whether these insults were officially sanctioned or if the community just kinda went along for the ride. But what's clear is that once the insults started, your social standing could collapse overnight. A Viking reputation was built on courage, honesty, and loyalty to kin. Lose that? You'd be as worthless as a worm in rotten fish, one fringe but delightfully weird tidbit. Some offenders were made to wear a carved wooden mask, painted with a giant nose or donkey ears, paraded around while children threw fish guts at them. Sounds like a carnival gone horribly wrong, but it worked. No one wanted to risk being laughed out of society. You can feel how vicious this social punishment was, even worse than a fine or a duel, because no amount of silver could fully scrub away the stain of being publicly ridiculed. You might remember how, in the last section, an outlaw was fair game to kill. Well, the Nid ritual was its social cousin. It made you fair game for scorn. The hall is crowded with people tonight, all eyes following as a farmer stands accused of selling watered-down ale. The skald begins to chant, weaving insults so cutting they almost sparkle. The crowd laughs, some people jeer, and the poor farmer stands red-faced, clutching his wool cloak like it might save him. You watch him shrink, each word another knife. This is a punishment that leaves no wound on your skin, but shreds your heart. There's a special cruelty in how communal this was. It wasn't just one judge scolding you. It was your neighbors, your friends, even the children, all watching. Your brothers, your wife, your father, everyone forced to share in your disgrace. It made the shame echo across generations. The children of someone mocked like this might carry a bit of that shame in their own reputations. The Vikings knew how to twist the knife. You shift against one of the rough hall pillars, trying to imagine how you'd hold your head up after something like that. You'd have to work for years to rebuild trust, if you even could. And the scariest part? Sometimes there was no road back. Once a coward, always a coward. Once a cheat, forever a cheat. The hall grows quieter now as the performance ends, the skald bowing with a grin as wide as a winter fjord. The farmer leaves, looking half dead inside. But you know the next unlucky soul is already waiting, praying they won't be next. It almost makes you miss the mud and filth of the pit from earlier. At least there, nobody called you names. As you move toward the door, your boots squish in a patch of spilled mead, the torchlight wobbling over rough floors. Outside, the wind still howls, and you hear the faint crack of sea ice splitting far off. The Vikings lived with that same harsh sound in their heads, the certainty that one slip could break them. Honor, trade, marriage, family, everything was held together by public respect, and that made shame the deadliest tool of all. A quick joke for your modern brain. It's a bit like a medieval one-star Yelp review, except here, your neighbors would keep shouting it at you until you wished you were never born. You step back into the night, drawing in the sharp salt wind, and think how easy it is to dismiss these rituals as primitive. But they were smart in a way. They didn't need armies of guards to keep order. They only needed stories, songs, and a powerful fear of humiliation. Next up, you'll have to face something even stranger. Punishments rooted in the supernatural, where Viking fear of curses and fate weighed just as heavily as any blade. So, walk carefully, traveler, and try to keep your reputation intact, because in this world, one slip of the tongue could cost you everything. You leave the hall behind, its echoes of laughter and jeering still clinging to your mind, and head toward the bone-chilling darkness of the grave field outside. Here, you feel the cold settle deeper into your bones, as if the ground itself might be judging you. Because Viking justice didn't stop with insults or silver. Sometimes it reached beyond the living and tangled itself with things unseen. The world of curses, omens, and the supernatural. Tonight, the burial mounds look almost alive in the shifting torchlight, casting shadows long enough to swallow you whole. You follow a winding path between them, remembering the old stories of Draugr, restless undead who rose from these very barrows to punish oath-breakers. And that wasn't just bedtime horror. It was a warning. If you failed in your promises, even the dead might come after you. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly believed their ancestors could climb out of the grave, or if these tales were just vivid morality lessons to keep the living in line. Either way, the fear was real. The Vikings often buried their dead with nails driven through their feet, or with huge stones pressed on their chests, to keep them from getting ideas about walking again. Better safe than sorry, right? A strange tidbit you stumble across as you circle one barrow. In some districts, they'd even bury a rooster alongside the body, hoping its crow would keep a spirit calm. Imagine that, a ghost hen whisperer perched at the end of eternity. You pause by one grave marker carved with tangled knotwork, seeing the faint outline of a man's name half worn away by centuries of wind. Maybe he was a respected warrior, maybe a liar who cheated his neighbors. You can't tell anymore. But you know one thing, his afterlife depended on how well he kept the Viking code. Viking justice didn't always need a flesh and blood judge. Sometimes the worst punishment was cosmic. Your ancestors might turn their backs on you, the gods might refuse you entry into Valhalla, or your name might rot away until no skald sang of you again. To a Viking, that was unthinkable. They wanted to live on in memory, not fade into silence. As you walk between the mounds, you sense how powerful this spiritual justice was. It made you behave even when no one was watching. You'd rather lose an arm than lose your place in your ancestors' long hall of honor. That was worth more than gold, more than land, more than anything. Your foot snags on a twisted root, almost pitching you into a grave's edge. You catch yourself, heart hammering, and shake your head. Careful there. You probably don't want to disturb someone whose family jammed iron nails into his feet to keep him still. Past the graves, you see a little shrine, a wooden post stuck with scraps of cloth and bits of bone. These were offerings to ward off bad luck. Basically a cosmic bribe so you wouldn't wind up with a Draugr problem. If a dispute couldn't be solved by fines or mocking songs, sometimes the answer was to settle things with the gods directly. Leave a goat hoof, whisper a prayer, and hope that fate would tilt your way. It almost sounds silly, you think, but if you lived in a world where winter might starve your whole village and thunder could burn your house down, you'd want every scrap of supernatural insurance you could get. Justice wasn't just about men and laws. It was about appeasing a world that felt personal and hungry. Remember the nasty pit in the first section? Well, at least that was straightforward. Here, you're dealing with a justice that's impossible to measure, ruled by dreams, prophecies, and strange signs. One night's unlucky dream could ruin your reputation for years. If you failed in an oath, your neighbors might believe your whole family line was cursed. And what about trials by ordeal? The Vikings loved those. Toss your hand in boiling water, pull out a stone, and if it healed nicely, you were innocent. If not, tough luck, you were guilty. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic or sincerely believed to reveal the gods' will. Either way, a burned, festering hand was a high price to prove you told the truth. You step carefully around the barrows, feeling the uneasy weight of centuries pressing down. These graves, these little scraps of superstition, were Viking law in another costume. You can almost hear the unspoken message, behave, or your ancestors will get you. As you move back toward the village, the wind pulls at your cloak, rattling the bones left as charms on doorposts. Another cosmic reminder. You live on the gods' good humor, upset them, and you'd be lucky if the worst you faced was a scolding scald. One last crooked smile as you remember modern people worrying about bad reviews or going viral for the wrong reason. In the Viking world, you could literally go viral beyond death, as a walking corpse, hunting down your broken promises. Yikes. The moon peeks through a shred of cloud, silvering the earth and making the burial mounds glow like quiet, ancient monsters. You step carefully back onto the village path, thinking how even the smallest wrong could follow you beyond your grave. Next, you'll see how Viking ideas of revenge took these fears and turned them into a weapon, one that could reshape families, feuds, and entire communities for generations. So, breathe easy while you still can. The Draugr are staying put for now. You leave the hushed graves behind, the dust of old bones clinging to your boots, and head back into the living world, where Viking justice was often far more immediate, far more personal, and far more blood-soaked. Because now you're stepping into the realm of revenge, and you better believe that was where the Vikings truly showed how unfair their justice could be. Your feet carry you toward a farmstead ringed by high turf walls. Inside, you hear a quarrel spilling into shouts, then silence, then a sob. You pause by the doorway, almost afraid to cross that line, because you know how these stories usually end, One wrong word, one spilled beer, one look taken the wrong way. And suddenly someone is gathering their kin to make things right. The Vikings practiced something called feud culture, where an insult or injury was rarely handled in a calm, court-like way. Instead, you had a sacred duty to take vengeance. If your brother was murdered, you were expected to avenge him, or risk losing your entire family's honor. And that vengeance didn't have to stop at just the killer. Sometimes you went after his brothers, his cousins, or the guy who handed him a sword. Historians still argue whether this was truly about honor or just a brutal form of social control to keep people scared of crossing their neighbors. But either way, it worked. Nobody wanted to poke the bear if the bear's entire family would burn down your hall in revenge. You ease closer to the hearth, catching the sound of a woman's voice, calm and deadly, naming a price for a blood debt. Because, sure, the Vikings could talk things out sometimes. That's where the Wergil system came in, literally man price. If you killed someone, you might be able to pay off the victim's family with silver or cattle instead of risking a lifelong feud. But the math was brutal. A child was worth less than an adult. A thrall was worth less than a freeman. A woman was usually worth less than a man. Even the body parts had price tags. Lose an eye, pay this much. Lose a hand, pay that much. It was a human menu that makes you shudder just to think about it. And if you couldn't pay, well, sharpen your axe. A quirky fact for you. Sometimes people paid the weregild in things as odd as falcons, drinking horns, or even decorated shields, if that's what the victim's family valued. Imagine settling a murder beef with a fancy bird. You watch the woman by the fire sharpen a blade, her voice going steady as she counts the debt owed for her brother's death. It's cold and practical, like tallying up debts after a market fair. That was the Viking way. Even grief was itemized, weighed, and bartered over. A quick flashback to the funeral games from earlier. Remember how they'd throw the corpse into a ship and send it burning? Sometimes, if revenge hadn't been settled yet, the family would keep the dead man's weapons, ready to pass them to the next kin who would carry on the blood feud. One death could set off an avalanche that rumbled for decades. And if the feud got out of hand, you might end up in outlawry, cast out of society entirely, forced to live in the wilderness like a hunted wolf. No friends, no food, no shelter. Only the promise that anyone who found you could kill you with no penalty at all. That was how Viking law handled the truly unmanageable, cut them out like a rotten branch. You step away from the farmstead, thinking about how that constant threat of revenge must have shaped every word and every glance. In a world with no police, no prisons, and no professional judges, your only protection was reputation. The sense that, if someone wronged you, your entire family would rise like a hammer to smash them down. It's hard to picture, but to the Vikings, this was normal. If you wanted peace, you had to be willing to go to war. If you wanted to protect your home, you had to be ready to burn someone else's. The idea of fairness looks laughable in that kind of system, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether these blood feuds actually helped keep order or just made everything worse, turning the entire culture into a powder keg ready to blow at any spark. But no one denies how central revenge was to the Viking mindset. The moon is climbing higher now, pale and sharp over the thatched roofs, and you feel a shiver run down your spine, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that in this world, one slip of the tongue could be fatal. Forget sticks and stones. Words could absolutely break your bones here, or at least trigger a whole clan war. You move on down the path, seeing men quietly sharpening axes, voices hushed as they plan the next move. A feud could start in a single night and end only when there was no one left to kill. No trials, no second chances, no appeals, just a slow, grinding wheel of vengeance that never quite stopped turning, and maybe, in its own twisted way, That was justice too. A justice carved from rage and loyalty, from the hard bones of a land that had no mercy for the weak. You can almost taste the iron in the air, feel the tension around every flickering hearth. They weren't kidding about the price of blood, were they? Next, you'll follow these patterns of revenge across the broader Viking world to see how entire villages, islands, and even kingdoms tried to survive the endless spiral of payback. So, keep your wits sharp, friend, because this is where it gets even messier. You leave that tense farmstead behind, breathing in the cold night air as if it might rinse away the copper tang of revenge. But as your boots hit the rutted track, you sense that Viking blood feuds didn't stay small. They spread like fire. One spark in a village could light up an entire region, turning neighbors into enemies and friends into executioners. You're about to see how far that spiral could stretch. Step carefully now, because you're crossing into territory where revenge wasn't just family business. It was politics. A feud between chieftains could rip apart whole communities, set islands against each other, and drag dozens of bystanders into a fight they never asked for. Think of it like a medieval soap opera with axes instead of breakups, and with way worse consequences. You approach a harbor town, its wooden piers creaking under the weight of cargo, where traders gossip as fiercely as they haggle. News of a feud spreads here faster than salted fish. You hear a man spit on the ground as he mutters about a neighboring clan that deserves every blade they get. And suddenly you remember how even trade routes could shift because of a single killing. Ships refusing to land at feuding ports, merchants rerouting to avoid getting caught in a blood debt. Historians still argue whether these community-sized feuds created stability by forcing people to be careful with alliances, or whether they were more like a constant contagious disease. But one thing's certain, no one was ever truly neutral. Even the thing, that big Viking assembly you've learned to respect, sometimes got tangled in these vengeance chains. Technically, the thing was supposed to settle disputes calmly, weighing evidence with a circle of free men under the sky. But imagine showing up to the court when half the jurors had already lost cousins to the same feud you were on trial for. Fair? You'd get a fairer shake wrestling a polar bear blindfolded. That's why many settlements quietly allowed a mediator to step in, usually a respected elder or a law speaker, who would try to negotiate peace by reminding everyone that too many funerals would mean too few people left to farm. It was less, let's talk about justice, and more, can we please not starve this winter? One odd little quirk. To seal a peace deal, the two sides might swap foster children. Yes, really. They'd trade kids as living guarantees that no one would break the truce. Imagine your dad handing you off to live with the neighbors who once tried to burn down your house, just so no one picked up a spear again. Vikings had their own brand of therapy, you could say. The feud system, twisted as it was, had a kind of logic. If you made revenge impossible to forget, people were forced to think twice about murder. And yet, as you stand near this harbor, you see how thin that logic ran. One broken promise, one stolen cow, and it all collapsed again. You move through a smoky tavern now, catching the glint of eyes that have seen too much. A farmer brags that his grandfather killed 3 men to avenge a brother, then bought peace by sending geese every winter to the victims' families. That's a payment plan you don't hear about on late-night commercials. Historians still argue whether these tangled payments, the animals, the coins, the children passed between families, were really meant to balance out the horror, or simply to buy time until the next blow landed. Because time was the only thing these settlements had. Time to rebuild, time to heal, time to hope another spark wouldn't land in the powder keg. Your fingers trace the rough grain of a tavern bench, and you try to picture living under that pressure. You'd measure every insult, every joke, every borrowed cow, wondering if it might cost you a brother's head next spring. Maybe that's why Vikings told so many poems about courage. They had to talk themselves into facing a world this unstable. Out beyond the tavern, you see a hill where an outlaw once took shelter, the wind slicing through the turf roof of his lonely hut. Banned from the thing, hunted by both sides of a blood feud, he survived on whatever scraps he could trap or steal. There's a certain bitter poetry to that. The same people who demanded revenge also made it impossible to survive once you lost. Remember how outlawry worked? You weren't just shunned, you were fair game, a target everyone could legally kill. Some of those outlaws lasted years in the wild, living like wolves, only to crawl back at last to beg forgiveness. It almost sounds romantic until you realize how quickly an outlaw could freeze to death or get torn apart by the next band of feuding cousins. You pause at a stone crossroads where three trails meet, wondering how many times Vikings had to choose between going home to avenge a brother or taking a path toward peace. It was never an easy choice, because in Viking culture, peace was usually seen as weak unless you proved you could fight first. That twisted sense of fairness ran bone deep like an infection. As you step away from the town, the sea breathes its salt into the wind, and you wonder if all those small acts of revenge really accomplished anything. Sure, it might keep a bit of order, a kind of balance, but at the cost of trust, at the cost of trade, at the cost of peace. The smell of fish and tar seems to linger like old blood, and as you move on, you sense the next piece of the puzzle waiting: Viking slavery, where even the idea of human worth was weighed and measured like cattle. That, too, was a kind of Viking justice, if you can call it that. You better brace yourself, because if you thought feuds were harsh, you haven't seen anything yet. The path you follow curves away from the harbor's tangy wind and into a low valley where the land grows quiet, almost ashamed. You can sense what comes next, and it makes your shoulders tense. The trade in people. Viking slavery, woven into their sense of justice, might be the darkest secret of all. You wouldn't have wanted to be on the wrong side of a Viking raid, because in their eyes, freedom was never guaranteed, no matter how noble you thought you were. The first shock hits you when you realize that slavery wasn't a rare punishment. It was normal, legal, expected. A man who failed to pay compensation might be sold as a thrall, a word that sounds harmless until you picture it up close. Bound hands, broken shoes, a lifetime of labor with no hope of escape. Historians still argue whether thraldom was more lenient than Roman slavery, or just differently cruel. Either way, you would not want to test it. You pass a sunken longhouse, its mossy timbers sagging with age, where a former thrall once earned his freedom by fighting beside his master in a raid. That, at least, offered a sliver of hope. A warrior's courage might buy you a place among the free. But most thralls didn't get that chance. They cooked, they cleaned, they herded animals, they patched sails, they dug turf. Everything their owners demanded. You can practically smell the wet wool and sour milk that clung to their clothes day after day. Sometimes, entire families ended up enslaved because one uncle refused to pay weregild for a killing. Imagine knowing your children's future was lost because of a feud you didn't even start. That is Viking fairness in its rawest form. A balance sheet of blood and silver, where you were just another line item if debts went unpaid. One quirky note you overhear in the sagas. A few unlucky thralls were said to have served both sides of a feud, switching masters whenever they were captured. You could end up cooking for the same family who killed your first owner, only to change hands again next spring. A cosmic joke if you were inclined to laugh through your tears. You pass a small shrine tucked against a hill where rough-carved stones bear runes for Freyr and Freya, gods who, ironically, blessed both prosperity and slavery. That contradiction should make you uneasy. The gods themselves didn't mind who was free, as long as their rituals were honored. Historians still argue whether this made the Vikings more pragmatic or more heartless. In the quiet night, you almost hear the muttering of old thralls who worked these farms, voices layered with centuries of loss. Some were treated well enough, eating beside their masters in winter when food was tight. Others were chained in pits, left to freeze if they refused orders. There was no standard of kindness, just the random spin of a chieftain's mood. You rest for a moment on a sagging fence, thinking how easy it is to romanticize Viking raiders with their shining ships and braided beards, until you see the human wreckage they left behind. For every ship's crew that came home rich, there were hundreds of ruined families whose only crime was living near the sea. Some of those captives ended up sold in Ireland or Byzantium, carried halfway around the world, never to return. A historical fact cuts through. The Viking Age's wealth was built not just on trade in silver and furs, but on trade in humans. Entire expeditions were funded with the hope of capturing people to sell. The word thrall itself probably comes from an older root meaning to run, as in someone who was made to run away. It's a brutal little detail you can't shake off. As you walk again, you pass a sleeping farmhouse, the roof low and turf-packed, where the family inside likely owned one or two thralls to help churn butter or chop wood. Even the smallest farms used unpaid labor whenever they could. And sure, a thrall might gain freedom someday, but only after years of unrecorded abuse. Justice in this world was measured by whose hands stayed tied and whose did the tying. Another strange tidbit floats through your thoughts. There were a few brave thralls who made it into the sagas, praised for wit or loyalty. One even saved his master's life in a duel and was granted land. You wonder if those tales were retold so Vikings could feel less guilty about the hundreds they never bothered to free. A dog barks in the distance, snapping you back from dark thoughts. You glance toward the horizon, where the sea still looms, reminding you that Viking power was never as simple as heroic raiders. They were also marketeers of flesh. That is a sour, unromantic truth to swallow, and you'd better believe it's part of the story. You keep moving through a tangle of farm tracks, boots catching in muddy ruts, and think how the land itself seems stained with the echoes of those voices. All the forgotten thralls who lived, worked, and died nameless. They were part of the Viking justice machine too, even if no saga sang for them. It's enough to make you question whether a society that measured honor in axes and silver could ever truly be fair. But fairness, to a Viking, was never about equality. It was about keeping your own kin safe, keeping your own skin intact, keeping the cycle going until someone broke it, or until you broke instead. The moon is high now, cold and pitiless, as you pass another crumbling ruin where captives once slept, and you realize that next you'll need to understand the legal system that tried, sometimes, to keep this chaos in check. Brace yourself. You're heading to the thing again, but this time you'll see its flaws up close. The night air bites harder as you follow the track toward the Thingstead, that wide circle of packed earth where, in theory, Viking justice happened. You can almost hear the stomp of boots, the rustle of cloaks, the low hum of men and women bracing for judgments that might change their entire world. The thing was the Viking version of a parliament, but don't go imagining anything as dignified as marble columns and powdered wigs. This was rough, raw, and a little bit terrifying. Torches sputter around the perimeter, casting long dancing shadows across the judging stone. You move closer, close enough to see how simple disagreements could explode into lifelong blood feuds. The thing might settle a case about stolen sheep, then pivot in the next breath to decide a killing. And what happens if the assembly got it wrong? Well, tough luck. That was justice. You could appeal, but only if your family was powerful enough to make people listen. one mainstream fact still holds. The thing was central to Viking life, a place where everyone who mattered showed up, at least in theory, to be heard. But historians still argue whether these gatherings were truly democratic or simply dominated by the local strongmen with the loudest voices. Maybe it was a bit of both. You watch a pair of chieftains bark at each other over a boundary line, voices sharp as the knives on their belts, and it's hard to believe much fairness would come out of that mess. You can almost smell the sweat and animal hides, sense the tension rolling off the crowd. Arguments over marriage dowries, damaged fences, even which gods should be sacrificed to next. All of it dumped at the thing. And while you might expect a learned judge to keep order, think again. Most verdicts came down to reputation, influence, and who had the bigger band of supporters standing behind them. A fringe tidbit you might find amusing. In some places, they held thing fines where, if the debate went on too long, you had to pay extra to keep talking. It was a kind of medieval microphone cutoff, in case your complaining got out of hand. Can you picture that happening at your local city council? At least you wouldn't have to listen to endless zoning arguments. Back in the Viking day, though, justice wasn't about impartial laws. It was about balancing the scales so grudges didn't destroy the community. You listen to one speaker describing a killer's weregild, a compensation so high the victim's family might never claim it all. Was that fair? Maybe. At least it kept swords out of people's bellies. Sometimes. You shift your weight, noticing how the judging stone is worn smooth from generations of elbows and knees leaning in. These stones saw everything. Confessions, tears, bribery, revenge. A man might cry to the gods one moment, then slip silver to a neighbor the next, hoping to swing a verdict. That was Viking justice. You used every tool you had, even if it was your last handful of hack silver. A night breeze coils through the crowd, carrying the sour tang of beer and fear. One family pleads for their runaway daughter to be forgiven. Another demands the fine for a burned boat. And you wonder, deep down, if this was truly about fairness or just a way to keep the whole fragile web from tearing apart. You catch a whispered conversation behind you. A young woman worrying about how the thing will handle her brother's crime. Maybe he stole grain, maybe he killed a rival. It doesn't matter. If the assembly didn't agree on compensation, the feud would roll on for years, staining the land with more blood. You feel sorry for her, in that soft human way that peeks through even the coldest Viking winter. Historians still argue whether the thing was a brilliant tool for peace or a stage for endless drama and violence. Watching it now, you'd bet on both. Because every group of people, even these proud warriors, needed something to hold them together. And if that meant public shouting matches and humiliations, so be it. It was still better than open war. As the moon slips behind a ragged cloud, the judging stone seems to glow faintly, the old runes around its edge catching the torchlight. You imagine the voices of centuries echoing through those grooves, each word etched deeper than the last. The thing might fail, but it was all they had. No state police, no high king to ride in and fix every feud. Just neighbors trying to survive together, even if it cost them every ounce of their pride. One last little fact you might enjoy. Sometimes they carve the names of executed criminals directly into the stone as a warning, a kind of Viking do not cross sign. Dark, but effective. You shuffle away from the circle, boots dragging across worn turf, thinking about all the ways humans try to wrangle justice out of chaos. Here, that meant yelling over a fire pit until a deal was made, or a life was lost. You can almost hear the echoes of 1,000 petty arguments, still floating on the night wind. The road out of the Thingstead is rough, littered with bones from half-finished feasts and broken clay cups. You pick your way through, feeling a shiver run along your spine. Next time you look at a Viking TV show with its proud council scene, remember the stink, the fear, and the unfair bargains made under those flickering torches. And as you step away from the judging stone, the night closes in, quiet as a grave. Tomorrow, you'll dig even deeper, into the sagas that tried to justify all this, the poems that made heroes out of butchers and tried to give meaning to these messy feuds. That, dear traveler, will test your sense of fair play even more. You step away from the judging stone, the crowd's rumble still echoing in your ears, and follow a dirt track that winds down toward a quiet settlement. There, small houses lean into the wind like old men with tired backs, and you can practically taste the smoke from peat fires drifting across the thatched roofs. You might think, after a long day at the thing, that the Vikings would rest easy, but no. Now comes the aftermath, where every decision made up on that circle of stones ripples through the lives of the people who have to live with it. As you wander past a doorway half covered by a ragged woolen curtain, a group of women gathers around a cooking pot, their voices sharp, tense, picking apart the verdicts. They know that a wrong ruling could mean a neighbor's revenge, or worse, a fresh feud that drags in every cousin from 3 valleys away. That's the thing about Viking justice. It didn't end when the assembly broke up. It followed you home, clung to your reputation, waited for a moment to strike again. A mainstream fact helps you ground your thoughts. The Icelandic Graga's law code tried to lay down some rules, but even that was mostly guidelines for compensation and feud management. Historians still argue whether such codes truly made daily life fairer or just gave a legal stamp to the same old power struggles. Looking around this village, you'd suspect it was the latter. Children chase each other with sticks, pretending to be warriors, and you catch snatches of their made-up arguments about whose toy axe broke whose shield. Even the littlest Vikings soak up the rhythms of payback and pride. That's the poison in a society where blood price stands in for true justice. The youngest hearts learn to measure worth in revenge before they learn to measure it in kindness. At the edge of a small paddock, you see an old man mending a fence with rough-hewn stakes and hear him mutter that no one will touch his land without paying. There's no faith in a fair trial here, only the threat of retaliation. If you had any illusions left about Viking nobility, they'd blow away like straw in the wind at that moment. There's a fringe tidbit you might like. Some Viking farmers put animal skulls on boundary posts as a magic charm against trespassers, a silent promise that if you cross this line, you'd be next. Kind of a neighborhood watch sign, Viking style, equal parts superstitious and practical. As you lean on a post outside the village hall, the sun slips behind a low ridge and leaves a chill settling over the fields. You can almost sense the sagas waiting to come alive, the tales that took all these messy feuds and tried to dress them up with honor, courage, and a sprinkle of fate. These stories served a purpose. They made the pain and unfairness seem noble, even destined. A hero might rise because a rival cheated him at the thing, or because an outlaw's blood debt could only be paid in steel. Your mind drifts to Egil Skallagrimsson, the poet and warrior, who turned his family's legal humiliations into verses that still survive 1,000 years later. Historians still argue whether men like him really lived by those poems or invented them to polish their image. Either way, the sagas let people believe there was meaning behind the bloodshed, that their own tangled fates weren't just random. A dog barks somewhere in the dusk, breaking the heavy quiet. You step forward, boots scuffing peat-damp earth, and feel the weight of centuries settle on your shoulders. The entire Viking justice system, from the judging stones to the farm fences to the heroic epics, was held together by one thread: reputation. If you were nobody, you had nothing. If you were somebody, you had everything to lose. Even in the smoky glow of the village's hearth, you sense how fragile all of this was. One wrong move, one insult too deep, and you'd end up on someone's kill list. No guards would save you, no police to come knocking, just the promise of payback, the circle of the thing, and whatever gods you could bribe to see things your way. And yet, through all of that, the Vikings made it work. They farmed, they traded, they built homes and loved their children. Because that was the secret. If you told stories fierce enough, you could live inside them, shielded for a moment from a world that had no real safety net. It was a patchwork, ugly and beautiful all at once. You pass a carved post at the village edge, runes cut deep where countless hands have traced them for luck. Maybe those runes once begged a god to keep the family safe, or cursed a neighbor who threatened their land. You can't help but brush your fingertips over the worn symbols, half believing they still hold power. That's how you survive in a society this unstable. A little hope, a little fear, and a story to bind them together. The road curves away, heading toward tomorrow's path, where you'll dive into how these same men who traded cattle or judged a sheep dispute could turn on a silver coin and become raiders. That's the final trick of Viking justice. It was never about stopping violence, just about pointing it in the right direction. You pause, letting the wind curl around you, tasting salt even this far inland. The sea always waits, doesn't it? And these warriors, if pushed, would one day build ships and sail out rather than settle down. Justice at home was messy enough. Justice abroad would be another story. And that, dear traveler, will be the next chapter you'll brave together, to understand how these landlocked squabbles could turn into ocean-spanning conquests. The firelight of the village flickers lower behind you, leaving you in darkness that feels oddly peaceful. Tomorrow, you'll keep walking deeper into this savage, fascinating mess of rules, revenge, and fragile peace. For now, let the hush of night hold you still, while the ghosts of old arguments fade like breath in the cold. You follow the dirt path through the hush of night, letting the scent of peat smoke fade behind you as another dawn threatens to break over the distant ridges. There's a sense, deep in your chest, that this world is about to shift again, that the tangled, half-civilized thing you've just seen will spill beyond its borders, carried on ships you can barely imagine yet. Viking justice at home was already a knife edge, but abroad it would become something else altogether. You pace past a cluster of sheep blinking awake in their pens, woolly bodies steaming in the morning chill. And remember how those same quiet farmers could transform. In one season, they judged neighbors over missing goats. The next, they leapt onto dragon-proud ships to burn entire towns to the ground. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But that was the Viking way. There was no neat dividing line between a homestead feud and a raid on foreign shores. It was all the same energy, redirected. You think back to a mainstream historical fact. The same assemblies that handed out verdicts at home also voted to launch overseas expeditions, approving ventures to Ireland, England, or Francia. Historians still argue whether these campaigns were driven by desperation, ambition, or simply the thrill of proving their worth. Probably all three, if you had to guess. After all, what better way to cement your place in a society obsessed with reputation than to come home with silver, stories, and maybe even a foreign bride? It's a jarring contradiction, seeing these men weigh a blood price for a stolen sheep one day, then sail out to steal entire herds the next. You almost have to laugh, a soft breath in the cold air, at how consistent the inconsistency was. Viking justice, it turns out, was never about universal fairness. It was about protecting your own, your kin, your reputation. If that meant raiding, well, so be it. The next village you pass is still asleep, its roofs hoar-frosted and silent except for the rattle of an old weather vane. You wonder how many of these quiet households once sent fathers and sons off to join a summer raid, maybe to die, maybe to get rich. There's a fringe tidbit to savor here. Some Viking crews included a law speaker who would recite settlement rights even on campaign, trying to keep their own rules intact while burning down someone else's. That's like bringing a referee to a bar fight, but the Vikings loved their codes, even if they bent them on demand, and who could blame them? If you lived in a world where one insult might kill you at home, you'd probably be eager to set sail and earn glory somewhere far away. Better to swing a sword in foreign fields than cower under your neighbor's grudge. These voyages let them breathe, let them test their courage, let them escape, if only for a while. As you move on, the earth soft under your boots, you sense the land still humming with those old memories. Stone fences, scratched with runes, bear the marks of people who carried their own laws like a banner wherever they went. They were farmers, poets, warriors, and lawyers all rolled together, believing fiercely that their judgments counted, even in the face of distant kings and new religions. Historians still argue whether this confidence was pure bravado or an earned tradition of self-rule. Either way, you can't deny it left scars across Europe, scars still visible in medieval chronicles, place names, and even a few surviving bits of architecture, Viking longhouses that somehow endured, silent witnesses to centuries of ambition. You wander past a grove of birch trees, their white bark catching first light, and remember the countless ships carved from their cousins. There's a deep irony in how wood that once marked property lines could be reshaped into a tool of conquest. That was Viking justice in a nutshell, rooted in the land, but never afraid to leave it behind. A distant rooster calls, breaking the quiet, and you feel your steps slow. Maybe you're ready to pause, to let the threads of this rough, complex world settle. You've followed Viking justice from the judging stones to the village hearth, through the tangled web of feud and blood price, and now you've seen how easily it flowed out on the tide, carried to foreign shores. And still, those Vikings measured their worth the same way, in reputation, in daring, in the stories they left behind. You glance down at your hands, as if half expecting to see them stained with the blood of some centuries-old insult. But of course, you're only a visitor here. Still, you can feel the weight of those old choices pressing into your ribs, reminding you how fragile even the strongest system of laws can be when no one agrees on mercy. The first real sunlight hits the ridge, turning the sea far beyond to molten silver, and you pause to watch it. Out there, new stories waited for those Viking ships. New victims, new judges, new scales of justice. Sometimes no better, sometimes worse. Maybe a monastery would burn today. Maybe an unlucky village would pay its own blood price in slaves and treasure. It feels brutal to even imagine, but that was the Viking inheritance. A justice system sharp as a sword, with no handle, only a blade. As the breeze catches your cloak, you turn back one last time to look at the farmsteads behind you, the quiet fences, the smoke curling from early fires. There is a tenderness there too, a reminder that these people raised children, buried parents, worried about barley harvests and wool markets. Justice was messy because life was messy, and maybe, you think with a sigh, that's the real lesson. A society can try to codify right and wrong, but human hearts will twist those rules to fit their own fears and dreams. For a moment, you stand still, letting your breath come easy, your shoulders slacken, your mind slip towards something gentler. It's a small blessing to know the dawn has arrived, that no one is shouting for vengeance right now, that you can rest in this quiet place. The wind down begins now, its words soft and rolling like a lullaby. Slow down. Feel the earth beneath your feet, cool and steady. Sense how the sagas themselves close around you, pages of myth and memory drawing shut for tonight. Let your heart beat steady, even if the stories were wild and tangled. You are safe, far from any Viking feud, far from the knives and the judging stones, far from the dark eyes measuring your worth. Breathe out, long and warm, as if sending away every worry, every old quarrel that does not belong to you. Let your mind ease into stillness, your imagination soften, knowing there is no blood price waiting to be paid, no harsh verdict to fear. Feel that hush, the same hush that used to settle over the thing after the arguments were done, when only the wind moved across the field. Let it settle around you, a cloak of peace. You have made this journey through old laws and rough rules, but you do not carry their burden. The dawn is yours, simple and bright, unjudged. Rest now. Let sleep hold you kindly, like a mother's song. And when you wake, may your path be gentle, your footsteps light, your worries far away. Because tonight the giants of rage and vengeance sleep too, leaving you alone with only calm.